We can start.
Good evening, all. On behalf of UNESCO New Delhi, I welcome you to the first of series of webinar being organized to commemorate the 50th anniversary of World Heritage Convention. The theme of our engagement is to take this opportunity to reflect not only on the past 50 years, but also to strategize for the future of the World Heritage conservation. We hope to discuss a global strategy for the World Heritage with brainstorming, not just highlight the way we will look at the heritage, but also its evolution over the past 50 years, with an aim to have a holistic understanding for the heritage for the future. Today, we are joined by several eminent panelists who will be sharing their insight on the topic covering different parts of South Asia. The session will be moderated by Professor Narayani Gupta, a distinguished urban historian who works on the history of Delhi. She taught history at Indraprastha College for Women before joining Jamia Millia Islamia in 1988. She was the founder member of Conservation Society of New Delhi and has also been a member of Delhi Urban Art Commission. Professor Gupta is also a prolific author with several publications into her credit. We are honored to have you, ma'am, here. Thank you. The following speakers for today are Ms. Juni Han, the Chief of Culture Sector, UNESCO New Delhi. Dr. Shika Jain, Director of Drona Foundation, Dr. Sharif Shams Imon, President of ICOMOS Bangladesh, Mr. Naveen Piplani, President of ICOMOS India, Mr. Gamini Vijaysurya, President ICOMOS Sri Lanka. Thank you all for taking time to join us. I wish you all the best for the upcoming discussion. Over to you, Ms. Narani, ma'am.
Sorry. I have the easiest task of all to listen to all of you and marvel at the amount of different things you all do, and combining teaching and active hands-on work and participating in policy-making decisions all over the world. We shall have the first person who's going to speak will be Juni Han, who is the Chief of the Culture Sector in UNESCO Delhi. Juni has, I cannot begin to describe the number of things she has done over the last 20 years at the headquarters, and particularly in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. In addition to work on advising state parties, she has she's coordinated various UNESCO flagship projects for cultural heritage sites in India. And the one project of hers which made me feel very excited was the exploration of unknown areas for cultural heritage, such as Siberia, through preservation of the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains, the first UNESCO project to be implemented in Siberia. She's also served as in the joint program for United Nations Volunteers for Cultural Heritage, worked for intangible cultural heritage, and at the end of it, it says she's a curator by training, which seems the smallest of the various things she has achieved. And she's also published variously and in articles and books related to heritage. She's a member of the ICOMOS, of course, and of ICOM. So I would welcome, if I may, Juni, and would ask her to introduce the webinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for this for the introduction. As a first speaker and also from UNESCO, I thought that it would be useful to share an overall view on the achievements made over the last 50 years, and also go through them along with you to start. From my perspective, there are majorly two aspects that are important to be acknowledged. Maybe Kartik, can you place the PPT?
I hope the screen is visible.
Juni, you are on mute.
Okay, I think the computer muted me. So second page, Kartik. Kartik,
Yes, ma'am.
can I have the second page? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, very good, very good. So the two aspects that I would like to share today, this session, within 10 minutes, I will try to respect the timeline as much as possible. The first one is the broadening of the definition of cultural heritage. At the time of the elaboration of World Heritage Convention, understanding on cultural heritage was quite limited to historic monuments and archaeological sites. Naturally, all the sites inscribed on the list of World Heritage since its inception reflected this narrow understanding on heritage. For example, by 1994, among the 410 properties inscribed on the list, 304 were cultural sites, 90 natural, and 16 mixed. And the vast majority of 410 sites were located in developed countries, notably in Europe. Then, as you know, in the 1994, the global strategy was launched, established by the committee and then launched, which has aim to ensure that World Heritage List to be representative, credible, and balanced by reflecting the history of humanity. And of course, the background, this paradigm shift lied in the major change in our approach towards our cultural heritage, was triggered by the fourth Mondial Conference, which is the UNESCO's fourth intergovernmental conference on cultural policy that took place in 1982 in Mexico City. So thanks to the global strategy, which greatly broadened the definition of cultural heritage, the international community started acknowledging many elements that were not considered previously as heritage. Of course, by the time the global strategy was launched, the cultural landscape was already officially acknowledged as a new heritage category by the World Heritage Committee in 1992. But other categories of heritage emerged and got their recognition thanks to the global strategy, such as the historic towns and cities, industrial heritage, heritage route, and etc., etc. To my personal view, the global strategy is particularly important and crucial for our sub-region because the region exhibits a great diversity in their cultural and natural heritage. This is also why our office have been giving the priority to promote global strategy at the sub-regional level at our office, and among many others within the World Heritage. And you may recall that Kolkata Sub-Regional Conference Global Strategy in South Asia, organized in 2019, towards this end. Of course, the broadening the definition of cultural heritage also necessitated our ways of looking at our heritage to be changed. Until 1994, the prevailing doctrine in built heritage conservation was the Venice Charter, which was established in 1964, which considered exclusively material only as an element to assess the authenticity of heritage sites. However, with the broadening of definition of cultural heritage, along with the adoption of anthropological approach towards our heritage, there was a great need to have another guidelines or position paper to be aligned with our evolved concept on cultural heritage. So the document on authenticity, so-called NARA document, then came almost the same time in 1994, which stipulated that the authenticity of cultural heritage lies not only in material, but also form and design, use and function, traditions and techniques, locations and setting, etc. This was truly a landmark position paper, which particularly allowed for a great number of heritage sites in Asia to be better understood. Almost 30 years after, the global strategy remains as one of the most important strategies within the World Heritage Convention. And I believe it is very much valid nowadays for our region of South Asia. I should not forget another important instrument, the UNESCO recommendation on historic urban landscape, which was adopted in 2011. The recommendations is in its own way a landmark one, I believe also, because it encompasses both built and intangible cultural heritage, but also makes rooms for contemporary addition in urban areas and urban history areas, which is not always the case within World Heritage. Second aspect of the important achievement over the last 50 years, I would say is that our approach towards heritage has become increasingly inclusive by providing importance to local community and by acknowledging their right to be consulted and involved. This inclusive approach base was made actually in 2002 on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, during which the World Heritage Committee adopted the so-called 4 Cs, which are credibility, conservation, capacity building, and communication, as the strategic objectives of the World Heritage Committee. Although C of community was not explicitly mentioned in 2002 Budapest document, actually the spirit providing importance to community was already there. And finally, C of communities was added as a 5th C in the strategic objectives by the World Heritage Committee in 2007. But I must say, actually, this people-centric approach was already embedded in the heart of the World Heritage Convention in 1972, because the Article 5 of the Convention clearly stipulates that it is important that cultural and natural heritage has a function in the life of community, thereby requests all the state parties to adopt a general policy to aim to give the cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the community. So since then, as you know, this 5th C has become one of the most important themes within the World Heritage arena. And as you know, the 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention was celebrated in 2012 with the theme of local community. Local communities is actually the raison d'etre of World Heritage for contributing to well-being of people. And it's also one of the themes linking our heritage, world heritage, to sustainable development. So from my side, these are, of course, it's very summarized but it gives somehow how the notion was broadened and how it became inclusive and then people-centric one. And so I will stop now at this stage. And of course, after all these speakers spoken, I think that there will be maybe a question further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Junie. I think that was wonderfully presented and made it sound as though there was a kind of pattern to the whole thing, which I suspect there was. But as we all know, the devil is in the detail as much as God is. And these terms like natural heritage, community participation, all these are things that get linked with other kinds of developments. I mean, which community, sometimes a community claims a place which other people don't regard as very important. Then you have all the problems of deforestation or the deliberate cutting of trees and landscapes and so on, which makes this whole project almost like an emergency operation. I mean, there's a lot that has to get done. And it's wonderful how this is all unfolded from a general statement about cultural landscape down to the separate ones, natural and historic urban sites, which is a very tricky business, and authenticity, which is equally difficult, as I'm sure I'm talking to people who know much more than I do. So thank you so much for putting it all together so elegantly. And now we have to look at them in detail and see what one can do about it. The next speaker is Shikha. Shikha Jain is an architect, and she specialized in preservation and community design. She heads the organization DRONA, which stands for Development and Research Organization for Nature, Arts and Heritage, and is founder trustee of the Indian Heritage Cities Network Foundation. Her experience in cultural heritage ranges from steering conservation projects for state governments in India to conservation plans for the Getty Foundation World Monuments Fund, nomination dossiers for World Heritage Sites in India. She's a consultant to UNESCO, chief editor of the journal Context Built, Living and Natural, and has several books to her credit. Visiting faculty in various departments and colleges of architecture, and the state convener for INTAC in Haryana. There's so much more to it, which I think for want of time, I will skip, and we look forward very much to hearing Shikha.
Thank you for the introduction, Narayani ji, and very good evening to everyone. I'm going to present World Heritage and Cultural Landscape, specifically focus. I hope my audio and the slideshow is visible.
Yes, Shikha. Now you are on mute.
You have to unmute, and
Okay.
Karthik, we
Yeah.
don't see the screen of Shikha.
Do you see the screen now?
No, ma'am.
Okay, sorry. I'll just try sharing again. There was a slight technical glitch.
There was, but it disappeared.
Is it visible now?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So a very good evening to everyone. And as I mentioned, I'm going to present about the cultural landscape category in South Asia. I will begin with the convention that Junie had mentioned. You know, we know that we are celebrating 50 years of the convention. And at the time when it was conceived, it took about quite a few years. It was initialized in 1969, and it was finally drafted in 1972 when the several state parties became signatory. At that time, the Director General UNESCO had mentioned, about this aspect of natural and cultural heritage being combined. And his statement was, for long, the subject of separate, even of rival forms of study and devotion, nature and culture now appear to be simultaneously threatened with death if they remain separated, and along with them man himself, who can exist only when the two are combined. This clearly shows the intention of the convention for protecting cultural and natural heritage in a collective manner. However, when it was drafted, we had initially two categories, the cultural heritage and natural heritage category. And it was, as the inscriptions grew, it was realized that there are more complex categories besides just isolating them into cultural and natural. A few years down, there was mixed heritage inscribed, which recognized sites both for cultural as well as natural heritage. And it was in the 1992 that the cultural landscape, so that the cultural landscape as a category was included in the operational guidelines. And as per this definition, it's enclosed in the operational guidelines under Annex 3. They are defined as combined works of nature and by humans, and they express a long and intimate relationship between people and their natural environment. It is further subcategorized into man-made, organically evolved, and associative cultural landscape, which I'll show in the next few slides. But if we look at the scenario of cultural landscapes across the world, to date, there are 121 properties which are inscribed under this cultural landscape category, with 6 transboundary properties and 1 delisted property, which was in Dresden Elbe Valley, on the World Heritage List. And these are under this particular cultural landscape component. If we look more specifically to South Asia, we see that we just have 2 cultural landscapes which are inscribed on the World Heritage List: the rock shelters of Bhimbetka from India, and Afghanistan cultural landscape and archaeological remains of the Bamiyan Valley. As I mentioned, the subcategories of cultural landscape include the landscape designed and created intentionally by man, which is the man-made landscape like the Mughal gardens of Kashmir, which are on tentative list of India. The second category is organically evolved landscape, and there are 2 kinds in it. One is the relic landscape, which is no longer living or growing, where we have Bhimbetka inscribed on the World Heritage List, which reflects a long interaction between people and the landscape, as demonstrated in the quality of rock art. Or we have the continuing organically evolved landscape, such as the Apatani cultural landscape, which is on tentative list of India, or there are several others. This is one of the largest represented category across South Asia, I would say, because of its living heritage. And lastly, we have the associative cultural landscape, where there is a specific association with a landscape element, as we see in this kind of property, which could be a potential transboundary, like Mount Kailash, which is revered both in Nepal and India by Hindus, Buddhists, Jain, and various religions from the world. Beyond these categories, now if we look at the global strategy that was also mentioned by Juni, and I won't repeat it, but definitely the point in 1994, where there was a move away from purely architectural view of the cultural heritage, and the need for cultural landscape category was recognized. It was even identified in the ICOMOS gap analysis. So if we see the gaps that were identified for underrepresented categories, the first 4, including nomadic, pastoralist, culture, transhumance, the agricultural landscapes, the sacred or symbolic significance of certain natural features, or the vernacular architecture and settlements, sort of fall under the cultural landscape category. We can also look at the gap analysis of this particular world. If we see the inscribed World Heritage sites in South Asia, we understand that there are very few cultural landscape sites across South Asia. Whichever country we look at. In this, we have extended it even to Myanmar and other areas, but it's largely the Indian subcontinent we are looking at out here. And we see that there are very less cultural landscapes. Specifically, when India was revising its tentative list, we also found that the cultural roots and cultural landscapes are underrepresented categories even on India's tentative list. And if we look at the list of World Heritage Sites in South Asia, as I already mentioned, there are only two cultural landscapes which are inscribed sites in the South Asia region currently. So while the region has a huge potential, if we look at the tentative list in South Asia, Afghanistan has 4 sites and a site like Baghe Babar, which comes under the man-made cultural landscape. Bangladesh has 5 sites. However, one has to still see whether any has a potential for cultural landscape. They are largely cultural sites. Bhutan has a very balanced list of 8 sites, which are 4 cultural and 4 natural. And I will talk about Bhutan later because they have really created a benchmark in cultural landscape, recognizing it as a category. Maldives, there is a single site. Nepal has about 15 sites where one can see that there are 2 sites which have the potential for cultural landscape. And Sri Lanka has 3 sites on the tentative list with one of Sripada having a potential of cultural landscape site. And similarly in India, because there was a revision of tentative list, now it has 49 sites on the tentative list, but there was a deliberate revision and improvement to increase the cultural landscapes, and it has about eight cultural landscapes and 4 routes, which also identify cultural landscapes. And this was because India went through a rigorous tentative list revision where there was a conscious effort to increase the cultural landscape. And though the increase was not as significant as one would have liked it to be, yet there was a substantial number added to the sites. There was also, by 2022, we see that India has 40 World Heritage Sites. Amongst these, one is cultural landscape. And the mixed one, which is Kanchenjunga, also has associative cultural landscape value. And India, with its working group, also tried defining the Indian cultural landscape, which was a definition that meant to include some historic cities also as a continuing cultural landscape. And this is a definition that was adopted by the Archaeological Survey of India in 2014. This is the Kanchenjunga National Park, which has a strong associative cultural landscape, and it's described as the mixed site, the only mixed site from India. But one of the benchmark initiatives, as I mentioned, in South Asia region on cultural landscapes is Bhutan, where you can see a specific cultural heritage bill that is drafted to recognize cultural landscape. And Bhutan says that it's not just specific sites, but the entire country. I mean, they recognize the landscape component as being so strong to be valued and protected. So this was an initiative supported by Japan and by the UNESCO World Heritage Center. And there is a specific publication that came through after several workshops in Bhutan. And it's an excellent example to move forward with. There are several independent initiatives, research on Asian cultural landscapes, and there are publications. So, academicians and researchers are constantly studying this particular category, defining looking at means of protecting it. And the primary challenge that remains in South Asia is to classify these typologies of cultural landscapes, because there are, given the range of diversity of the culture nature adaptations across the countries, and the predominance of associative religious landscape and sacred geographies in South Asia, there is huge potential. But there are researchers and scholars who have looked at the associative, archaeological, relict, institutional, industrial, religious, biocultural, and even extending it if we look at the historic urban landscapes. Another category which extends into this is the roots, which actually, if you look at Annex 3 of operational guidelines, they now accept heritage roots as an extended cultural landscape. And while the cultural roots are defined by ICOMOS, the operational guidelines use the term heritage roots, which again allows us to look at the culture nature component within the roots. And recently, I feel there is a potential in the project MOSM that India launched in 2014 to propose serial transnational cultural landscapes, which would be one way of looking at the potential of cultural landscapes in South Asia and beyond that in these 39 countries across the Indian Ocean. The landscape perception, this is to conclude, as I am saying that in various cultures, it's there is so much range and variety, and South Asia really has huge potential right now in understanding the indigenous ways, the perception of various cultures on cultural landscape, including traditional texts like the Tamil Sangam, which actually classifies landscapes in poetry. And there are similar examples across South Asia. So this is what I feel one needs to look at and move forward when we are looking at World Heritage today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikha. That was fascinating. I mean, that was in the sheer numbers that you talked about was so awesome. It just, I mean, to my mind, I'm not in any of your professions, but it strikes me that the word cultural is extremely fluid, and heritage roots or sites and so on all have different connotations, often at different times also. So maybe one should think of having sort of connected with World Heritage, sort of maps of countries, because after all, a place like South Asia has, I mean, it's all of it cultural landscapes. I mean, we happen to have picked on certain ones, but there's so much more. So instead of, apart from worrying about what should be World Heritage sites, you should also think of the larger picture. And when I say the region, meaning South Asia, you think of it in terms of connectedness and different periods of time. So you have one axis of time and one of geography, and you will get all kinds of fascinating stories, I think, which do not come out in a strictly chronological or numerative manner. So there's a lot to think about. And as a teacher, to my mind, it seems to be something that should be tacked on to every social studies courses, not just architecture and conservation and so on, but something at a much more elementary and less daunting level. It should be something that should be part of our way of thinking. So thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. Our next speaker is from Bangladesh, Dr. Sharif Shamsunma, who teaches in a cultural heritage management institute at Macau Institute of Tourism Studies, where he's the academic coordinator for the Cultural and Heritage Management Program. He also teaches architectural conservation in the University of Hong Kong. Trained as an architect and urban planner, he has an MBA in finance and a PhD in urban conservation, and trained at ICROM, an integrated urban and territorial conservation. He's published research papers and book chapters on the subject. He specializes in cultural heritage and tourism management, especially in historic settlements, and has conducted capacity building training programs. As an international expert on cultural heritage, he regularly carries out technical evaluation for World Heritage. Thank you very much. I hope there's something of Bangladesh in what you're going to say, because I have an in-law connection. My family came from Borishal in Bangladesh. So do go ahead.
Thank you. It's very nice to know that we have a Bangladesh connection among the audience. All right, thank you. So while I will touch Bangladesh a little bit, but it's mostly focusing on South Asia. So my presentation will talk about three interlinked subjects. One is the nature of our historic cities and the complexity that we're dealing with, and what we have achieved so far, and then where we're heading to. So I deliberately choose a so-called non-heritage picture because this is from old Dhaka, and the issues that I'm talking about, the complexity I'm referring to, is somehow captured in this image. So when I am talking about historic cities, I'm not really talking about the relic cities. I'm talking more about living cities. So places like these are, we can find throughout Asia, Southeast Asia specifically, or South Asia. But very seldom do we see places that remain almost intact in its historic form. What we see is places within modern cities, places that are just a mix of all sorts of things. Now, when you talk about heritage or world heritage or urban heritage, we do not really focus on the buildings. But ironically, I'll be using a building example to explain or highlight what we are dealing with and what we should be doing to address these issues. So beyond these buildings, we have people, and several of our speakers, first Juni and then Shika, also mentioned about people. We talk about nature as well. So we have, when we just move our cameras, move our eyes away from these buildings or beautiful architecture or the landscape, we see people. But then these places, it's never a static place. It's been transforming, evolving for a long period of time. But sometimes it's taking a trajectory that may not end up themselves in a place that we can be, say, proud of. And often to understand what we have, we refer to certain models which are often heavily influenced by Western understanding of historic cities. But the issue is that whether this is right or is it something that we need to do about it. So when you compare these places with the old pictures, then it never has been like this. Something has led to this one. And it's not that the conservation professional didn't do anything, or it's just a mixture of complex processes that ended up creating places like this. So we have high density development on the left-hand side. We have a historic building, the area which has been encroached and illegally occupied by people who have nothing to do with this building. And then we see a very old building waiting to be demolished and constructed with the modern materials. So one of the concepts that might help us understand what is going on is the concept of obsolescence. So many of these places, what we see in a dilapidated condition. So what led to this? Many have changed completely in terms of their function. And of course, as we have seen in the previous picture, many are being demolished and reconstructed, redeveloped. To understand obsolescence, we need to look at, break it into smaller components. One is, of course, the physical one that is very obvious to us. In many of our historic cities, we have these buildings crumbling down, not well maintained. Sometimes it's outright dangerous for people living there. But then obsolescence can also caused by economic reasons. For example, if the cost of continued use is too high compared to its substitutes, they become obsolete. And then, of course, the functional obsolescence, where these buildings or places become unable to serve its intended purpose. And then the technological reasons where efficiency service offered by alternatives are much better than the street places, like street buildings. And then we have the social issues. For example, a change in the social attitude or demographic changes. If we prefer to have a lift in a building, if we want to have more modern facilities, modern toilets, so on and so forth, and then we may not like these places anymore. And of course, if you want to drive our cars, that's another thing. In some places, the legal and political issues can be also, leading to obsolescence of places. New capital city is built. So the old capital is abandoned or, is lost its primary functions. It's moved to somewhere else, and that might lead to, that kind of obsolescence. And of course, that is the market forces. It's more economically viable to, just get rid of something old and build higher, taller, bigger, something. Now, this we're talking about building, but if you just think about the concepts of the concept of obsolescence and the factors that affect them, then we can see that actually we apply the same to our historic cities. But apart from the physical one, in most cases we see, especially in our cities, in South Asian cities, it's never, in most places, never been abandoned completely. I mean, this is a nice picture that I really like. This is a traffic stand in the middle of the road. So the traffic police is no longer, needed here. And this has been occupied by something else. And we can see everywhere, so we don't really abandon for whatever reason, but rather we adopt them for something else. Now, to continue with this concept of obsolescence, and if you look at the life of a building, the optimum performance level start to decline at one point. And then there's a line of minimum acceptable performance. When the building fails to perform, meet this requirement, they become obsolete. People abandon them, they redevelop them, or do something else. So if we, in this dimension, if we continue with these, then we can see that when we maintain this well, then okay, we can probably achieve its functional life or design service life completely. But for many reasons, we cannot or we do not maintain our place as well. So what happens? This leads to the reduction of its functional life or its physical life. In a way, we actually lose a place, lose a building before they actually should be, left alone or for decay. So if we then continue with this one, we can, with some actions, increase the life of a place. It could be renewal in the form of changing its physical condition, or is increasing or enhancing functional needs or purpose, or it, various other factors that I mentioned earlier. By changing those things, we can actually enhance or prolong the life of this. But there's another social factor, and we have been talking about people a lot, and this is also an important factor that affects the way we deal with our places. What if the minimum acceptable performance level changes? So far we've been thinking that, okay, this is a fixed line, fixed level. But what if we want better efficiency? We want better safety, better comfort. Then the optimum level that we are talking about so far changes. And when that changes, then the design service life again shifted backward. So again, we go back towards having reduced life for these kind of places. So when we talk about, as I said, renewing places and prolonging the life of this building or maintaining their meaning in the current society, often we end up taking these kind of actions. I'm sharing some pictures from Macau. So-called adaptive reuse, but it's actually not really an adaptive reuse. It's just keeping the facade and changing something else. I mean, adding something completely new. Now, what do we do here is that we focus on the physical aspects of a city only. Often the the aesthetic side of it, and often what we experience at the street level. But then, if you look at the cities, the way they change and the factors that change them, then we see that it's just addressing the physical dimension of a place will not help us protect, save the places that we care about. And there are three dimensions that affect the deterioration of the change process. One is the institutional dimension. Often we don't have the political vision to address our historic cities, or often we don't have the legal or the administrative framework to deal with our historic city. We focus too much on the new part of the cities or the new cities a lot. So these places often, very frequently we can see that they don't have enough planning control, and that leads to encroachment, illegal construction, all sorts of incompatible use. And the role of public in the decision making, and also the social dimension trend. People are leaving these places. They live in a better place, high-rise buildings, apartment buildings. They have cars, and old cities cannot be accessed by a car. All these kind of things, and often it's family structure. So I will not go into the details of these things, but we can see it's a complex process, and often they are a cyclical process. And to break this cycle, we need to address not just one, but we need to address multiple things often at the same time. So the other one is the tourism effect. Many of the World Heritage inscriptions that I reviewed more recently, I see tourism motivation, is one of the driving force for inscribing sites on World Heritage List. So what happens again, World Heritage inscription really draws attention to a particular place, and that is good in many cases, and we dedicate a lot of resources for that, but it also creates a market attention, tourism potential, and somehow, and this is again, we have seen that we start to focus on more prominent structures, national monuments, so-called. And then the other places becomes neglected because all the resources are diverted to few places and not other places. And when the tourism and demand increases, they want more facilities and services like hotels and transportation, all these things, increases the price, the rent, and makes these places difficult for the local inhabitants. So they move out often somewhere, or they cannot just afford these places. And then both tangible and intangible effect, then overall the place changes and becomes something very different from its original self. So the things that affect our places, as I say, when I say our places, I'm talking mainly about South Asia. And two pictures, one is from Sri Lanka, Sigiriya. I know the statistics here, 2019, Sri Lanka received 1.9 million tourists. The right-hand side picture is a 16.6 million tourists in New York City. And we see that concentration of people, just going up to the hill up there, the Sigiriya World Heritage Site. And within New York City, we don't see that kind of concentration, the overcrowding. So what happens, Sigiriya maybe is just one unique place in a separate location, but in many places we see this concentration of this because there's no other alternatives. One is a heavy dependent on tourism for economic development, so no diversification or very little scope for diversification, and then also a lack of alternatives for people to visit these places. And these kind of things lead to, again, something undesirable. So in conclusion, if you talk about obsolescence, it's actually the result of a complex interaction between multiple factors. And to plan and to design that to delay obsolescence is not so straightforward. And other thing that we have to be open-minded, because we cannot foresee all changes, future changes. So that means you cannot take a very design approach that we design something now. We have to be interacting with the changing world at the same time. So when change is constant, and all these things that we're talking about. Now, so far we have talked about like the cultural landscape concept coming into play. We talked about the historic urban landscape. We talked about a nature-culture connection. We talk about community. But all of these are actually happening gradually as we understand that we cannot think about our places in isolation of the rest of the world, of the global, or the planet where we are living in. And to connect them, I think still we have to go back to this concept of sustainable development. Whether our heritage management contributes to sustainable development, not whether we conserve a building or a place, whether we have maintained authenticity or integrity, but all together, what we have. Now, I mean, we hope that Ratesh would be here today to share his, wonderful example. So I'll just have a few slides on that. Because I really loved his project in Nizamuddin. So we have tangible heritage and intangible heritage, and the other programs that deals with people, socioeconomic programs. And when all three work together and works towards improving the quality of life of people and through heritage conservation, then that's what we want to achieve now. And so we have all these things. And again, this is from the Nizamuddin Bosi project. And the World Heritage, Humayun's tomb, is the center of that. And it acts as more as a catalyst for all sorts of positive changes. And when we have this kind of models and coming up, more models like this are coming up that we can follow. So this is my last slide. And this is what we want to see, that something is changing, and it's changing is not just which is static or which we only in buildings or places, but people's life. And this is what I think should be the future. I mean, we have already started to do that, but we want to focus more on that when we deal with urban conservation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that resonated with all of us. And it reminds me of the time I first saw New York stars, and I looked up and I said, how long will these last? And they said, we built for about 30 years. And I was appalled, these enormous pieces of architecture being designed for a short life of 30 to 40 years. So obsolescence is a tricky thing. I mean, there can be obsolescence which is natural, and obviously there is the obsolescence of people wanting to destroy and rebuild and do something else. I think those charts that you showed are things that should be enlarged and put up in every municipal and development agency, because the whole problem seems to be largely to do with maintenance. There is no interest in maintenance, and so you have places becoming obsolete and therefore unattractive, and all that follows like a domino effect after that. I just wanted to bring in a tiny story about the college I used to teach in, called Indraprastha College in Delhi. Now, this was built as a temporary home for the commander-in-chief while New Delhi was being built. They were all accommodated in very cheap structures in another part of Delhi. And I've looked at the files in the archives, and it said this is only meant to last till 1937, very clearly. The college is still there in that same building, beautifully restored. And the students always said ours is the most beautiful college in the university. And it functions perfectly well. So that is the opposite of obsolescence, where something which they were planning to have a short life had a very long life. So thank you very much for that, because I think it's a problem that we want to look towards. Now I invite Naveen Piplani, who's an old friend from when I was working in tech. He was Director of Studies at the Center of Conservation Studies in York. He runs an architectural conservation practice in New Delhi and has worked as a core member of the multidisciplinary team for the conservation of the Taj Mahal, the first National Scientific Counselor of Ecomos India, Vice President of Ecomos International Training Committee, an expert from India at the Ecomos World Heritage Panel. He has researched and published widely on conservation, education, and practice, and is involved with collaborative networks and organizations across the globe. Naveen.
Good evening, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Considering the time that we have at hand, I'm going to just highlight 5 key aspects that differentiate cities when we look at them from the framework of World Heritage, particularly in the Indian context. And these 5 concepts are really embedded in the convention and the operational guidelines itself. But I'd just like to make an argument that they don't particularly work as they were intended to be in the Western European, or let's say larger Western context, and in the race to get as many sites inscribed by countries that were not really actively engaged, let's say, in somewhat polite manner, in the framing of the concept itself. Now, the first one is authenticity. And authenticity is key to World Heritage Convention and the inscription process itself. But that really is a key departure point for when you look at Indian cities or Indian heritage cities. Well, our heritage cities are not as as clean or as impeccable as European cities. So one has to really look for the concepts of authenticity that would match up with the framework that the UNESCO Convention puts forward. And whereas in the in the Western context, it is more associated with the material aspects, what you have, and the fabric, and so on. In our context, it was more to do with the spirituality and let's say the non-tactical aspects, the practices, the life that went on in these cities. And this life keeps on changing. So it's very hard to pinpoint and say that, look, this is authenticity of Varanasi. And when you inscribe Varanasi on World Heritage City, this is the aspect of authenticity that we are going to be preserving or enhancing or conserving or the rest of it. So I would like to move away from the material aspects of authenticity, which makes it rather rigid to be preserved, to a more workable concept which Professor A.G. Krishnamanan had mentioned a few years ago, that authenticity can even at times be created and not always necessarily preserved. So that was my first argument, to look at authenticity from a Indian perspective. My second argument comes at integrity. Now there again, one aspect, and also very clearly highlighted by Shams, by Iman, if you're looking at the aesthetics or the visual aspect, and that is what defines the integrity of that building, site, or place. And it works very well if you're looking at Taj Mahal as a World Heritage Site, and there is certain integrity in the Char Bagh, and the way you look at it, and the way the monument is placed, and the way you move around, everything is kind of quite regimental, dictated, that is how you will go, that is how you will disperse, that is how you will enter the mausoleum, and that is how you will come back, and the rest of it. And it is assumed that by doing so, you will be experiencing the site in its full integrity, while not even going to some parts of the site, because the site is quite big. But most tourists would just go over the central path straight to the mausoleum and back. So we've not even experienced, and the same must be true with Humayun's tomb and many other sites where it is expected that a visitor will get to feel the integrity as it was when at the time of its inscription and mentioned in the nomination dossier. Here again, the concept that that was being discussed, I think at one of the meetings of the World Heritage Panel a couple of years back, pre-COVID times, which also is embedded in the INTAC Charter for the conservation of unprotected architectural heritage and sites, is the idea of evolving integrity, which means integrity can also evolve with time and with people who are going to be using the site rather than fixing it to as it was. And this discussion, I remember, particularly came up for the during the nomination of how do you say, cemeteries and necropolises and places of let's say commemoration, where they are almost frozen in that period of time when a big war would have happened or a big battle would have happened, or you were kind of remembering the frozen period of past, and that is considered to be the integrity of that site. Well, it doesn't work in place where when we are looking at cities where there's a lot of movement, there is migration, there's a lot of new things happening on everyday basis. My third aspect is about management. And again, here our cities fail because we are not managing something which is given to us to be then inscribed on the World Heritage List, which then be managed. It'll have its own management system, mechanism, strategy, and the rest of it. What we are wanting to do is looking at how do you manage change, because that is what our cities go through on everyday basis. They're always changing. There's something new. There's something added. There's something even deleted from the city fabric. Things that get demolished. There are things that get affected by the family structures, commerce, economics, etc., and even politics sometimes. And the example is the Central Vista. So these things happen. So there you don't manage the fabric as is given to you, but you manage how the fabric or authenticity or the value may change while still keeping the sense of it, the spirit of it, and not getting rid of the soul of the place or the city. My fourth point is about living heritage. So this is heritage that is not what we have got, and we need to preserve it and safeguard it as the Archaeological Survey of India typically does. But here is heritage that is flourishing, that is also defining and redefining itself. And that is also a heritage that is being created for the future, and not, you're not necessarily looking at the past in the sense that Eloy Regal would have meant. But you're looking at the future and then saying, look, where is our heritage going to be in the future? So that is the beauty of our cities, where our cultural traditions are also getting redefined. We are not sticking to what happened 2,000 years or 1,000 years. So the living aspect of our cities need to be brought into the core of World Heritage nomination process and not looked upon as something, well, that needs to be discussed by experts, many of whom do not or may not clearly understand what we are trying to explain. And my final point is about development. We cannot afford to freeze our heritage cities. We cannot afford to let people who are living there say that, look, you guys have to live like this, but we will live somewhere else. And then we will come here on heritage walks and enjoy the pastness that you people are living with, but we won't let you develop. We won't let metro come in. We won't let underground cables come in. We won't let some other facilities and amenities come in, but we will live in smart city. So the smart city is a separate component, and heritage city is looking at the past and is in shambles. So there has to be some talk between the smartness and the development and the futuristic aspirations of the citizens of the same context. They may not be in the same physical, place, but they all need to be looked upon as citizens of a particular period who are wanting to aspire and go further, as the other part of the city is wanting to be. And I think again here, the nomination of Delhi, New Delhi, where one of the components of the nomination was Shahjahanabad, while the other was New Delhi. And it was quite a dilemma when we were putting this thing together. And of course, because we didn't know that this is the future of New Delhi going to be, therefore the whole nomination process had faced what we all know, and it really didn't go through. So finally, I'm going to put forth a suggestion that the notion of outstanding universal value, which the World Heritage Convention has defined in a certain manner, needs to be re-looked at in the Indian or the Eastern or the Southeast Asian context. And we are arguing that our cities may not have outstanding universal value. They may have an outstanding Indian value or a national value. So we are not competing with European cities to be outstanding. We are outstanding in the way we are. We are happy the way we are. And if you are happy to accept us as the way we are, then we are happy to be on the World Heritage List. But to be on the World Heritage List, we cannot suddenly now become some other animal, because we are not that other animal. We are what we are. So that whole value system and the concept and the approach and the rest of it has to be aligned to how we are and how we have been and how we will be, which is in stark contrast to what Regal was saying, as looking at past as pastness, John Ruskin with the golden stain of time, Morris with his own idea. We are not a European nation. We are an evolving, changing, developing Indian subcontinent in a post-colonial, free thinking context. And two documents that I want to put for further elaboration is first, of course, the Nara document, which I still feel has been given some attention, but it has not still been fully, exploited, if for the lack of any better word. And second is the in-text charter for the conservation of unprotected architectural heritage sites, because these cities are largely unprotected. They are not with the ASI or the state departments. And the only document that kind of presents the scenario in conservation here is the in-text charter. So those are the two documents that perhaps need a bit more deliberation and embedding into the World Heritage process. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Naveen. You really set the cat among the pigeons. Now we are everything will have to be re-looked at with your very vigorous arguments, which I think all of us sort of understand, but I don't quite know how this figures or how it will be worked out at the level of the UNESCO finding some kind of universally acceptable terms, even if not universal value. So that is for you to want to take up later, but it was a very stimulating kind of critique of terms which were used in good faith, but you now are questioning. Our last speaker is Dr. Vijay Surya, who, yeah. I'll just go into it straight away since we're a bit short for time. He's a conservation professional from Sri Lanka and has been involved with the convention since the 1980s and has worked on the process of monitoring the state of conservation of World Heritage sites generally. I think I'll just stop at that if you don't mind, and we'll listen to the presentation. Yes, Dr. Vijay Surya.
Thank you. No, that's good enough. I'm going to say a few things about looking at the past. So Good evening. Thank you, Junhee and the UNESCO team for organizing this important event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. Over the last few months, I participated 6 such events organized under different themes and in different countries. I also had the fortune of joining the 30th and 40th anniversary celebrations held in Venice and Kyoto. Personally, for me, give me a second to explain. This year marks the 40th anniversary of 40th year. It's not an anniversary to celebrate, but 40th year of my association with the World Heritage Convention. I was only 20 years of age when I had the pleasure of writing. Actually, it was only 5 lines. The first tentative list for Sri Lanka, and first three nominations in 1982 with the team led by my guru and mentor, Roland Silva. So this is to show that things are evolving and you can't think of writing a tentative list in 5 minutes or nominations in 2 days. In the same year, a few of us created ICOMOS Sri Lanka, which later contributed immensely to World Heritage. I remember sitting in the panel, nomination panel, where we recommended the inscription of 53 sites in 2 days, and there were 14 sites from Italy and so on. From state party to ICOMOS, I moved to ICROM, where I served 15 years for the World Heritage directly. I had the opportunity to contribute to resource manuals, capacity building strategy, improving monitoring World Heritage, including periodic reporting, and developing the format for SOUV, or Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, and program on linking nature and culture, in addition to numerous things. So in fact, my first reactive monitoring missions to this country, India, Konarak Sun Temple and Hampi, that led to, of course, putting the site on danger listing. My last major task was global review of reactive monitoring together with the nature specialists, some of the things you can see in this picture as well. Now, why I said some of these things about myself, because I had the opportunity of experiencing a change or evolving things. World Heritage discourse is evolving, has evolved. As you know, the definition of outstanding universal value came only in 2005. In that same year, they decided that it can still change. In fact, Navin, you have the opportunity to enter into that debate. And at the same time, heritage sector is evolving. And what we are trying to do is to integrate some of these changes into our system. And that is the expectation. I'll come back to that. And of course, this experience I have looked at from the point of view of history of conservation. You have this pre-19th century traditional knowledge system that were ignored when they were developing the modern conservation movement in the mid-19th century in Europe. And then from 17 to 90, there is what I call the transition period, where the World Heritage Convention and the values, the discourse was introduced, and the challenging discourse also took place at that time. And post-1990, I call it the people-focused approaches developed from fabric-focused approach in the pre-70s. And for that, World Heritage definitely contributed immensely. And you heard some of these things: cultural landscape, which talks about people and their interaction, and World Heritage Management, communities, linking nature culture, and policy on sustainable development, and so on. At the same time, heritage sector also evolved. The NARA document on authenticity, although it doesn't talk much about authenticity, Living Heritage Program in 2003, Intangible Heritage Convention, and people-centered approaches, historical landscape approaches. All these have people-focused elements. And indeed, the transition period, I mentioned that there were sort of criticisms or revisiting or the heritage discourse. And some of the pioneers, it's interesting, have mentioned that they were not fully aware of, for example, the Raymond Lanier says the Congress participants in 1964, he's the leader of that team, did not realize the complexity of international preservation. And so like that, there were, and of course, there is the Eurocentrism, which was recognized by the pioneers themselves. And then, of course, this has, the sector has transformed from looking at monuments and sites to cultural property in the 60s to heritage, which like already mentioned, there is an opportunity to expand the notion of heritage, and also from conservation to protection to management, and then fabric or based approach and values-based approach to people-centered approaches. Indeed, there is a sort of paradigm shift from sustaining heritage to heritage sustaining broader societal well-being and benefits, which of course already mentioned by previous speakers focusing on this. And the people-centered approach is something that we should be looking at because of previous speakers, and also what has happened. The doctrine of people-centered approach is about placing people at the heart of the heritage discourse and recognizing that a focus simply on the well-being of heritage is inadequate, or the materiality is inadequate. It must be expanded to pursue the well-being of both heritage and society. That is the reason why this is being promoted by the World Heritage. And then what is next? You heard these wonderful things that we have done, we have achieved, but where are we going to go? Perhaps you may not be happy with some of my conclusions, but the experience of so much in the 40 years and doing so much work, I think my conclusions are going to be somewhat different. It doesn't mean that we should not focus on what is going on. We should do that. In fact, the next 50 World Heritage Committee has suggested the theme for the next 50, World Heritage as a source of resilience, humanity, and innovation. Somewhat complicated, but I think we understand what they mean, and there is no problem for us to pursue that at regional, national, or international level. But remember, what we have is a convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, which has very interesting articles like Article 5. So my point is, have we used this, or whether we should use this and go local, let World Heritage as a platform or vehicle to promote developed heritage sector. My question to you is this what we want in the future? Indeed, going local, I have expanded. You heard so many things being said. There were nice the philosophical, theoretical, academic aspects that we had a discussion, but how can we integrate them into our system? For that, we need to think nationally, or which locally, which I mean nationally. And the problem is that we need to integrate these emerging new themes, new emerging ideas into heritage sector at national level, and we need to reform our heritage sectors to accommodate changes as appropriate. I'm not saying that take everything, and based on context. The things like people-centered approaches and some of the cultural landscapes and all these things. Have we changed our legislation that was gifted by the colonial masters in some countries? In Sri Lanka, we have the one established in 1940, and with the colonial mentality. Can we accommodate cultural landscape in this? Can we accommodate these wonderful theoretical aspects of cities and the World Heritage itself? No. To do that, we need to remove a major Asian conundrum, archaeologization of heritage. All our countries, we still have departments of archaeology managing our heritage. This is a real problem, and we need to rethink of this. And we need to revisit the centralization or the strict public sector control of heritage, and the secularization, taking away all those people values, all those people-centric values, because we embrace the Western conservation ideals. And then, of course, assess our capacity building needs. These are directly coming from the World Heritage. And at regional and international level, we need to proactively engage in World Heritage activities. You will see there was a survey done recently about the 50th anniversary. Only 11% of participants from Asian countries. And research on emerging themes like authenticity. Now you heard very interesting points from Naveen. We need to revisit OUV. Yes, we did. We should. And have we done that? Now, on authenticity, we had a sort of regional review of that, the publication already done. And in fact, the conclusion is that it is not a very useful concept for us. And in fact, countries like Australia never use that. So we should engage in these aspects. Fortunately, there are a number of countries now engaging in the World Heritage Committee, but that we need more and more of those things. And of course, things like collective things like harmonization of tentative lists and more effective use of category 2 center. Of course, we have one center, and networking, maintaining link with Asian countries, and of course, joint activities, some of which you heard. So my point is that, yes, let's keep World Heritage as a sort of platform, and let's take its opportunities, its knowledge that is being generated, very useful, well thought, some of them are, but it's important that we go local if we are to integrate any of those things. If you are not integrating any of those things, and they will be only academic exercise. Thank you for all of you, but we need to change this profile also. There are 3 faces from Asia, but I think you will realize that you need to change this, you need to engage, you need to work on these things. So going local is my message for the future of World Heritage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully put across. And I think so many ideas have come up in this discussion, in the presentations. I think we should now move to the questions, if there are any, from the audience. And question and answer. Are there any questions?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. There are two questions. One is to the gentleman from Bangladesh. I like your analysis of the concept of obsolescence, illustrated graphically, very convincing. This is from Nanda Deva in Sri Lanka. I think that's a comment rather than a question. Then Jana Das Chaudhary says, our universal value is what needs to be looked at in the changing and evolving 1972 convention. Again, that's a comment rather than a question. Yeah. Yes. I think in that case, if there are no more questions or queries, we'll. Oh, sorry, there's one more question, two more questions. Hold on. Anonymous attendee says, in which schools of thought are heritage professionals educated or trained from the South Asian context? Shall I read the board out? The next says, how do we amalgamate old and new heritage? This question is to Naveen and to Mr. Sharif. But from PLU, CTV. Then the last question.
Thank you for conducting.
This seems to be just a comment of appreciation from Savar Suri, and would love to connect with Team UNESCO. Yeah. So does anyone want to reply to the sole kind of question, which is in which schools of thought are heritage professionals trained or educated? Or how do we amalgamate old and new heritage? That's, yeah. Well, Naveen, would you like to try?
Yes, I can. I am not absolutely clear what the first question is about, but the second one could be an entire day in explaining how to amalgamate the old and new heritage. A short answer to a long explanation is that it really depends on the context and the condition of the heritage and where it sits, how it sits, what is how people look at it, how the owners look at it, how the custodians look at it. There are more questions which come out of this question. And perhaps again, the short answer would be that we have to be sensitive to both the heritage and the context and the people. If you're looking at it from a people-centric approach, then what would people or the local communities want that heritage to be before any new intervention is proposed? Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, you're muted, Dr. Gupta.
Sorry. This is to Mr. Sharif. This was the same question about old and new heritage.
All right. I think, this division between old and new is a bit artificial because it's a continuum. We cannot just draw a line, this is old and this is new, because the way we understand heritage is our cultural expressions that we value, right? So, and in that sense, we are continuously creating something. Maybe one day we look back and we say, okay, this is we value among all the things that we have done as human beings living on this planet. So this is not about amalgamating two different things and dealing with them in a different way. So there's so many things that we haven't recognized it yet, but maybe tomorrow we'll do it. The day after tomorrow we'll do something else. So it's a matter of how we look at that, how we perceive, what are our cultural expressions and which ones we value. And the process of doing that, again, is a much more complex. I think Naveen also mentioned that. There are so many questions, but most importantly, first, we should not see them separate things. Or, we should not draw lines between them. So you're muted again, sorry.
Sorry. Would any of you like to ask each other any questions? Julie? No?
I
No,
do have a, sorry.
no, please.
I just wanted to ask Gamini one question, because in his slide, he showed, how one has moved from the value-based to the people-centric. So I think there was a people component even in the value-based approach. So I just wanted to ask him what is the specific difference?
Oh, yeah, you are absolutely right. It's an extension to values-based approach. But the point in values-based approach was there was this so-called consultation participatory process, but eventually it is more the expert dominating. So this is, there are a lot of writings about it. It was appreciated, it is appreciated, getting the participation of many, and including indigenous communities and so on, and looking at all values, but still there was also a dominance from the expert view. But in the people-centered approaches, what we are saying is, yes, think of the people first. Look at their needs, look at their aspirations, look at their values, and then go on. So it's an extension. All these are extensions of sort of, that's why in a sort of arrowed manner. Thank you.
Yes, Junie?
Yes, I'd like to make an additional comment. To my understanding, I think convention itself already embedded the people-centric element, actually. As I mentioned, the Article 5 of the World Heritage Convention specifically request the state parties to adopt a policy which aims to give a function to cultural and natural heritage in a life of people, life of community, in a life of people. So I believe World Heritage Convention actually was really very, very much forward-looking convention. And it was already there, but we kind of, under the prevailing, the dominance of European-centric notion, this people-centric element was a bit forgotten in the meantime. And gradually we came to understand it was already there in the heart of the convention, but we realized gradually, and we came back actually after 30 or 40 years, back to the spirit of the convention. So that is how I perceive, this people-centric and value-centric. I don't think it is very clear. Both are very much important. And then people-centric approach ultimately questions us why we conserve heritage, why heritage are important. Of course, apart from its power to as a cohesion for society, etc., etc. At the end, the convention also, it says that heritage also exists for people's life. We conserve heritage for the betterment of people's life. I think that is the essence of the convention, and also I think that's why also we link the whole World Heritage Convention into sustainable development. heritage should definitely contribute to society and to people's well-being, and at the end, the whole humanity. So we often, before, I think our approach was, we often forgot maybe this human aspect, because we were so much, under the Venice Charter, so much focused on conserving it, and then gradually realized that, Buddha Charter, which came in 1990, I think that, which highlights the spirit of place, the spirit of the heritage site. What is the real value of heritage site? Heritage site value is not residing in the stone material itself, but it resides in the value which was given by the society. So I think for me, this is really kind of going back to the heart of the convention, which was very much forward-looking, which already had all this human dimension in itself, but rediscovering. So, this is, my interpretation of the World Heritage Convention. And then, of course, whole way of conserving and why we conserve heritage. It's for people's life and the people's betterment.
Thank you. I like that idea of rediscovering, going back with a sort of freshness created by distance. I think it's important. Would anybody else like to?
Yeah, can I say something about it?
Please. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, Junhee, you are perhaps right. But if you look at how I have visualized the history, which comes to you in the transition period between 70 and 90, the World Heritage Convention came in, but only after 90s, virtually mid-90s, that people focus came into being. You are absolutely right. There is this particular phrase in the convention, but World Heritage Committee adopted communities as one of its strategic objectives only in 2007. So only after that they started promoting that theme. So that's why I have said after 1990, yes, maybe you want to say it's discovery, rediscovery, or whatever, but early, before that, focus was on listing monuments and sites on the World Heritage List, and nothing about management, nothing about communities, nothing about people, and so on, listing monuments and sites and groups of buildings as defined by the convention based on the Western conservation philosophy that was developed based on Western secular values. So yes, you can say that things have started rediscovering and so on, but that's why I said after 90 only it has happened. So yes, it should go forward in that direction.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Well, I'll contribute, give my little 2-bit to this, which is extremely, it's really from what you might call the community, from the non-specialists. Incidentally, I find the word community is something that can run into difficulties. I won't go into details, but maybe you could think about it, because if you create a sense of ownership, it's not necessarily the people in the locality who will have a sense of ownership. There are certain areas which are historic settlements. The case of Nizamuddin brings that out very clearly, but it's problematic. So I would rather focus on 2 other things, which to my mind are very important. One is that we must not have a cutoff date in a very strict term for the heritageness of it. And give a lot of attention to and respect for, either as part of an area or individually, to architecture particularly, or landscapes created in the 20th century. Because in India, certainly, we find that now there is a tendency to be a little casual about things which were built, say, 40 years ago or 50 years ago, and deciding that we can do without them and have something more modern. This is going to become quite an affliction, and it's going to lead to the destruction of many recent works of architecture. And I think this is something that should be thought of very seriously. The second thing is, I'm surprised. I remember Mr. Fort of the UNESCO in Delhi saying that there were no, as far as he knew, no material produced for children, correct me if I'm wrong, on World Heritage Sites. And a series was started in Delhi. It stopped at 5 little books. But I think it's imperative that children should grow up with this. And in the caption, the word world is very important, because we still tend to treat these as national heritage sites. India has so many, Pakistan has so many, and then we get into this counting game. We've got so many more than they have, and so on. That is not what you should do. It should be to try and link them together so that you understand that countries' borders are not something that have been written in stone. I mean, they've been different earlier. People have been coming and going and so on. So we must show the internationalness of it and create a sense of delight in linking countries rather than isolating them in terms of their independence and separateness. So these 3 things, the world, not country, attending to children in a very imaginative way, not in terms of information, but in terms of stirring up their imagination and sense of wonder. And thirdly, to respect our recent works of architecture instead of hiving them off for the next century to take care of. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot and enjoyed every bit of the session. Thank you very much for all that you said. And now from Delhi, good evening and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
you. Thank you very
Bye,
much.
Damini. Bye, Mon.
Okay,
Bye,
bye.
Shikha. Bye,
For
Dr.
this
Gupta.
Bye. Thank you.
excellent
Bye, Junie.
moderation. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you.